The radio cut off at the exact instant he passed behind the moon. 1 second there was Houston in his ear, controllers and data, the familiar background hum of mission control at work. The next second there was nothing. Not static, not silence exactly, just the absence of everything that connects a man to other men. Michael Collins was alone on the far side of the moon, at a distance from Earth that no human being had ever been, in a spacecraft built to carry 3 people, and now carrying 1. The score, as he later put it, was 3 billion plus 2 over on the other side of the moon, and 1 on this side, and whatever else might be out here that no one had yet confirmed or denied. He had 47 minutes before the signal came back. He had done this before. He would do it again. He went back to his checklist. That was July 20th, 1969. While 600 million people on Earth were watching Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk on the moon, the third member of the Apollo 11 crew was 69 miles above the surface, passing in and out of radio silence, running systems checks in an empty spacecraft, and waiting. Michael Collins has been called the forgotten astronaut, the man who stayed behind, the one who didn't land. In 50 years of interviews, lectures, and the book he wrote about all of it, one of the finest memoirs in the English language, he consistently refused that description. He said he was perfectly satisfied with his seat. He said the mission had been built for 3, and his third had been as necessary as either of the other 2. He said he felt, during those long hours orbiting alone, not loneliness, but awareness. Not fear, but something approaching exultation. This is the story of that seat and the man who held it with both hands. Michael Collins was born on Halloween of 1930 in Rome, Italy, where his father, a United States Army Major General, was stationed. He grew up moving between military postings, entered West Point at 18, graduated in 1952, and joined the Air Force. He became a test pilot. In 1963, he came to NASA as one of the third group of astronauts, the same group that included Buzz Aldrin. He was 32 years old, precise, dryly funny, deeply literate, and had a quality that distinguished him from most of his colleagues. He could explain things. He later proved this in a book that astronauts and engineers still recommend as the most honest account ever written of what it was like to do what they did. But in 1963, the book was still a long way off. His first mission was Gemini 10 in July of 1966. He and astronaut John Young rendezvoused with 2 unmanned spacecraft in orbit, and Collins performed a spacewalk, drifting along a 50-foot tether to retrieve an experiment package from a second vehicle. At the end of the tether, with the open capsule 20 feet behind him and the Earth 400 miles below, he made the assessment he needed to make and came back inside. He had always been that kind of pilot. He added fear to situations only when the situations required it. As command module pilot for Apollo 11, Collins was responsible for the spacecraft that would carry all 3 men to the moon and bring them home, while Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface in the lunar module. Collins would keep Columbia alive, maintaining its systems, flying it, and executing whatever maneuver the situation required. He compiled 117 pages of custom emergency procedures covering every failure mode he could imagine. He memorized them. He also designed the mission patch, the eagle with an olive branch flying above the lunar surface, no names, because the mission belonged to everyone. He also lived with a weight the other 2 did not. If the lunar module's ascent engine failed on the surface, he could not go down for them. He would have to leave. He would have to come home alone, and Armstrong and Aldrin would remain on the moon. President Nixon had a speech prepared for this. Collins knew about the speech. He had already decided, before Apollo 11 left Earth, that he could carry that weight if he had to. He did not talk about it much. He did not pretend it was not there. On July 20th, at 4 in the afternoon Greenwich time, the Eagle undocked from Columbia and began its descent. Collins watched it go. He later described it as a gangly, awkward-looking craft, nothing like people imagined. He watched until it was a point of light, and then it was gone. He was alone. For the next 21 hours, he orbited the moon in Columbia, completing a full revolution every 2 hours. On each pass, he crossed the near side, where Houston could hear him, where the Earth hung in the black sky, where Armstrong and Aldrin were somewhere on the gray surface below. And then he rounded behind the moon, and all of it cut off. The Earth disappeared. Houston disappeared. Armstrong and Aldrin disappeared. He could only orbit and wait and orbit again. He scanned the surface from 69 miles up, looking for the tiny gleam of the Eagle. He never found it. The moon was too large and too indifferent to give anything away. Serious. On one of those passes, as Armstrong and Aldrin were making their final preparations for the moonwalk, Collins went silent as he rounded behind the moon again. The radio cut. He was the most isolated human being in history. Not because of what he felt, he would insist on that for the rest of his life, but because of what was simply, factually true. Every other human being in existence was on the other side of a sphere of rock 3,473 kilometers wide. There was no one to hear him. There was no one who could know if something went wrong for 47 minutes. He wrote about it later in his book. He wrote, "I am alone now, truly alone, and absolutely isolated from any known life." And then he added what surprised almost everyone who read it. He said he felt this not as fear and not as loneliness, but as awareness, as anticipation, as something close to exultation. The vast and silent dark of the far side of the moon was, for him, not a horror. It was a fact. He was a test pilot. He had been trained to assess facts without adding to them the feelings they did not require. He went back to his checklist. On the near side of the moon, on his 31st pass, he saw something through the window he had not seen before. The Eagle was ascending, a small bright flare rising from the gray surface 69 miles below. He had been scanning for it for hours. Now it was there. He called it, later, the most beautiful sight of his life. The docking was manual. Collins flew Columbia toward the rising Eagle with the precision of a man who had memorized 117 pages of procedures and knew which ones applied. The two spacecraft came together. The latches clicked. He opened the hatch. Armstrong came through first. Collins later said Armstrong had a look of relief and happiness that he understood completely. They were going home. Reflective. The three of them splashed down in the Pacific on July 24, 1969. They spent 3 weeks in quarantine, a precaution the protocols required. They went on a world tour, spoke to Congress, stood in the rooms where decisions had been made about their lives. Collins was the quietest of the three in all of it. He gave his interviews without drama and said precisely what he thought and no more. He left NASA in 1970. He ran the National Air and Space Museum for 8 years, overseeing the building that now holds the spacecraft he flew. He wrote his book. He painted watercolors. He fished. In his 80s, he was still doing a triathlon every year. He died in April of 2021, at age 90, of cancer. He never claimed more than his seat. He said repeatedly, without visible bitterness, that his seat had been necessary, that a mission built for three required three, that the third had been him, and that was enough. There is something in this that the moon landing story rarely has room for. The most famous photograph of the entire Apollo program, Armstrong and Aldrin on the surface, the Earth behind them, was taken from the vantage point of the man who stayed in the spacecraft. There is one person who cannot be in that photograph. Collins is the single exception. In every photograph taken of every human being who has ever lived, the camera and the photographer are on the same side of the lens. Collins is the one who isn't. He knew this. He thought it was interesting. Neil Armstrong, who rarely offered praise voluntarily, said Collins had handled his unusual role with the thoroughness of a craftsman. That was Armstrong's highest register. He did not say it about many people. The space race had produced its share of men who wanted the glory. Collins was not that. He was something rarer, a man who understood exactly what his contribution was, measured it accurately, and found it sufficient. He did not perform humility. He simply did not need what the other seats were offering. Michael Collins had his seat on Apollo 11. He brought those two men home, and for 47 minutes at a time, on the far side of the moon, he held the most solitary post in human history, and found it, in his own words, almost exhilarating. Subscribe. There are more quiet legends still waiting to be told. The next one begins in January, one day before an anniversary that Neil Armstrong never stopped carrying.